Okay guys, welcome to part 2 of best Dark Souls 3 bosses. Number 5, the final boss of Dark Souls 3, at least the main game, Soul of Cinder. Yes, just like I had the final boss of Elden Ring, the final boss of Dark Souls 3 is also pretty awesome. Like I love the design of Lords of Cinder, and it perfectly matches who Soul of Cinder is. It's basically an incarnation of all the previous people who linked the first flame, which includes Gwyn, the final boss of the very first Dark Souls, as well as the protagonist of the first Dark Souls as well, and many others. And in some ways, you almost feel like you're fighting all the other players. You can basically make an argument, and yourself too, because, as I said, he's basically an combination and incarnation of all the previous people who linked the first flame, which is something you're about to do after defeating him. And I also love that the design perfectly matches it. Like, look at his mismatched armor. Like, it's obvious that on his chest he has something from Ehorm the Giant, and then he has like the crown that, like, I believe of High Lord Volnir would remind me of, and then he even changes his style, as you already probably seen in this fight. Like, sometimes he fights with you with the sword, another time he fights with you with this fire sword or with magic. Yeah, or with that spear, that he just changed into, which in my opinion was the hardest of his attacks. Although, yeah, and I also love that he, like most of the From Software bosses, he's fairly balanced. When I was first fighting him, I thought he was like nearly impossible because of how aggressive he was, but like all of the other From Software bosses, especially in Dark Souls 3, he's actually, again, he's about learning and remembering and then mastering. And once you fully master it, the fight becomes pure fun. And as I said, he definitely fits a final boss. Like, he's certainly much better than Gwyn, who was also a pretty cool final boss, but I think Soul of Cinder very much beats him. Let's just enjoy the end of this final boss of Dark Souls 3, at least the main game. Number 4, and that's another DLC boss, and the final one, Slave Knight Gale, is actually basically the final boss of the entire franchise, since he's the last boss of the DLC. And he's often the favorite of many, rightfully so, because he is amazing.
What? Still here? Hand it over, that thing, your dark soul. For my lady's painting.
For starters, the setting is so amazing. It's basically fought in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, because technically this is at the end of the world, after Saint Night Gale destroyed the whole world, and you are fighting him. And yet, he's actually technically not a villain. In fact, if you understand his lore, it was like he more like didn't really like doing it, and more like it's complicated, but he didn't really like he's doing it. It was more like he was forced to. But yes, this is the lore, both the lore and the setting make it awesome, and he looks pretty awesome too. Like, I love the way in the first phase he just crawls around, basically. It's really cool. And also the first phase is actually fairly easy. Yeah, he has lots of health, but if you learn how to dodge his attacks and attack at the right moment, he's fairly manageable actually. Now let's see this other cutscene.
Is this the blood? The blood of the dark soul.
The second phase, I personally, is even easier than the first one, I say. It's the third that where things really get hard and complicated, because in the second phase, you see, you just go in the back of him and slash him. Yep. And when I said he looks awesome, yeah, I love his red cape, and I also love how he has a hole in his torso, kind of further, which basically further drives the point that we are fighting at a post-apocalyptic wasteland and he's decaying practically. And his attacks are lots of fun to avoid actually. It's one of those where it's actually really fun to avoid his attacks. And as I said, I generally like villains that are actually evil. Like, I'm often not fond of fighting like sympathetic, but here I actually love it. I actually think that this is one of those cases where him being very sympathetic actually makes perfect sense, and I really like it. And as I said, he's the very final boss of the DLC, which makes him the final boss of Dark Souls as a whole. And he's even better than Soul of Cinder, who was also a super amazing boss, like he was right before him. Let's just enjoy the end of this fantastic fight, and the end of Dark Souls 3 as a whole by this fight. Number 3, Pontiff Sulyvahn. Yes, this guy is magnificent. Like, I love the very beginning of the fight, like how he slowly walks towards you and soon takes out his 2 swords and attacks you with them. And I also love his design and appearance, like he's basically the Pope with 2 swords fighting with you. And also he fights with you right in the center of his cathedral, And I love that so much. You're basically fighting an evil pope right in the center of a cathedral. And he is pretty challenging too. In fact, he's giving trouble to a lot of players. I personally don't have big problems with him. I beaten him faster than I've beaten some other bosses actually. But he isn't, certainly not very easy. And I also love the lore because in just like Aldrich, this guy is just plain evil. But I like him more than Aldrich because he's way more challenging. And I just think he's better. Aldrich was awesome too, but this guy is so much better. And he's also likely the most evil character in the entire Dark Souls franchise. Let's just enjoy the end of this fight. Amazing fight with that evil bastard. Number 2, Sister Fried. Yes, she's actually another DLC boss, and you could in some ways also call her final boss, since she is the final boss of the first DLC. Like Slaying That Gale was the final boss of the final DLC, but she is the final boss of the first DLC. Let's enjoy the cutscene.
Bring Frida to me, please. Canst thou not see the flame flickering once again? Soon will it surge. I can see it, feel it.
Fret not, Father. We have no need of thy flail.
There she is.
'Tis only the flame quivering at misguided ash. Please avert thine eyes. I will snuff out these ashes for good.
Sister Fried is simply awesome. Like, you fight her in this very small room that's very deathly cold, and I love the very dark, wintry atmosphere that you feel while fighting her. And she even gives you very much frozen attacks. And she's also one of those bosses that's challenging at first, but then once you get a hang of it, she becomes fairly easy. And that's actually good, because that shows and truly feels like you mastered something. Once a boss that used to be very difficult at first becomes almost a cakewalk, basically. And she's basically one of the most balanced bosses, actually. And that's only the first phase of her fight too. I also love the lore behind her, because in the second phase, it's also wicked cool, especially now Feather Ariandel joins the fight, and although I mostly attack him now because he stands in one spot, but I love his design as well, and the way the chair is attached to him, and that he's so much bigger than Sister Fried, yet he's basically the underling of her, basically. And I also love the way he moves around the room as well. But as you see, like Feather, this phase is actually fairly easy, though sometimes you have to watch out for Feather Ariandel's moves, but it's a much easier phase actually, but still really awesome. Though the third phase, that's where real awesomeness begins, but all three phases are awesome. Now third phase begins. What I love about Sister Fried also, I was trying to mention it in the very first fight with her actually, but I got so good that the fight ended quickly. And what I also love is that the lore behind her is also awesome. Kind of like Aldrich and Pontiff Sulyvahn, she is decidedly not a good person, she's actually pretty evil as well. And I loved it. I loved it a lot actually. Because because I love that there are some villains in From Software that are actually not sympathetic but plain evil, and you just enjoy taking down. And Sister Fried, just like Pontiff Sulyvahn and Aldrich, is definitely perfect example of that. And this third phase I think might actually be my favorite, because in some ways it's basically a harder version of the first phase, and like at first you kind of get frustrated, but once you learn all her moves, it becomes ultra fun to be dodging all of her attacks. Like, and I will say, one more thing I love about it is I love how small and weak Sister Fried looks, but she can actually also, as I said, give you a challenge. So, overall, Sister Fried is certainly one of my favorite Dark Souls 3 bosses, and one of my favorite From Software bosses. Like, she's kind of like counterpart of Malenia from Elden Ring. The Dark Souls 3 counterpart of her, of course. Let's just enjoy the end of me putting down Sister Fried. And my favorite Dark Souls 3 boss is the Nameless King. This guy is just fantastic, and both of his phases are. Like, I love how he starts the first phase on a dragon, and let's talk about first phase first. Like, I love the design of his dragon. Maybe it's not quite as awesome as Dark Eater Midir, he's much smaller, but still a pretty awesome looking purple dragon with feathers. I loved it. And I also love the setting, like you're basically fighting him in the clouds. Yeah, it's a very unique setting, like compared to all the other bosses. Like, I remember how when I first we'll get to it in the second phase. For now, as I said, first phase is pretty awesome, and I just love it so much. It's actually also fairly easy once you get a hang of it actually, but second phase more than makes up for it. It actually makes sense for a first phase to be fairly easy, but, and I have to mention it again because I can't mention it enough, the setting in the clouds is simply magnificent. Let's enjoy the cutscene. Second phase, this is where things get really tough. And I still remember how when I first heard a lot about the Nameless King and heard he was the hardest boss in the base game actually, I was really feared it, and the fact that I found out he was optional, I really considered skipping him actually, but once I started actually fighting him, I already knew no, I'm never gonna give up on that boss, even though he was actually getting me right in the very beginning of this fight, and the fact that I had to go through the first fight over again made me worried how I'll be able to figure out. But the pure spectacle and sheer awesomeness of this fight made me not give up and continue to persist to beat that guy, and it totally paid off. It was so worth it, and as I said, I love the Nameless King so much. It's definitely my favorite fight in Dark Souls 3. Like, Nameless King is just fantastic, and the fact that there's a theory that actually has lots of evidence to back it up, that he's actually a son of Gwyn, the final boss of the first Dark Souls. And honestly, this theory makes perfect sense. Is it definite? Maybe not, but sometimes leaving a little something ambiguous is actually way more fun than directly telling you. So yes, this theory makes perfect sense, but sometimes it's fun to make things a little ambiguous. Either way, the best fight in Dark Souls 3. And the music is also pretty fantastic. Let's just enjoy me taking down one of the hardest bosses in Dark Souls 3 and the most awesome one. Okay guys, so here are my top 10 favorite Dark Souls 3 bosses. Tell me your favorite 10 Dark Souls 3 bosses. And by the way, I will maybe, not anytime soon, but I will someday try to do 10 favorite bosses from other From Software games. Bloodborne, Sekiro, maybe first Dark Souls, but please don't pressure me. It will not be anytime soon. But I will try my best to someday do the 10 favorite bosses from those games as well, but as I said, it will not be anytime soon, so please don't pressure me. But here you have my top 10 favorite Dark Souls 3 bosses. And please subscribe to this channel, and I'll talk to you soon in another video. Talk to you later, bye!